The following is a text exchange which occurred between brothers on November 22nd, 2021. 5 p.m.
Have you heard of the New England vampire scare of the 19th century? The case of Mercy Lena Brown in Exeter, Rhode Island may have influenced the character of Lucy in Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Nope, I would almost certainly blame the Puritans if it weren't that late though. Seems like they're kind of scared, but they were done by then.
It has to do with tuberculosis. It seems that people thought that consumption patients looked like they were being drained of their blood and life forces, so they would dig up their loved ones, burn their organs, and eat the ashes to try and stop them from killing the living.
That's silly. Everyone knows that TB comes from rooms with corners.
Unsurprisingly, in the case of Edwin Brown, despite eating the ashes and organs of his mother and two sisters, he didn't survive very long after the ritual exhumation.
Oh well.
Apparently, this went on across New England for a while.
They do love a good hysteria up that way. Straight from the heartland, this is Things I Text My Brother. Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of Things I Text My Brother, a series of conversations which have taken place between the brothers Drouillard on subjects spanning the neighborhood and the globe, which will hopefully leave you smarter, kinder, and better looking. Today we're going to jump off from that dramatic reading that you just heard and discuss the topics therein. Maybe we'll talk about vampires. Maybe we'll talk about mass hysteria. Maybe we'll talk about consumption, Puritans, witches, saints, or suspected sinners. But we haven't plotted an exact course because we want you to join us on that journey. I'm Jeff. This is Brad. Let's talk about our texts. But before we delve back into our text exchange and get consumed by 19th century hysteria, we need to take a look back because it's always important to make time to cleanse ourselves of our past sins and to continue our boundless quest for self-improvement through worthless information. Thus it's time for ablutions and edification. Today I'm going to start off with one of your favorite things. Not an ablution, not some edification, but an ablutification.
I like when we get to create new words.
Oh yes, and that one's all yours. This one goes back to episode 24, which was about slushy drinks and the frozen brains of the North. Do you remember that episode?
I do. Anytime we're talking about slush puppies or ices, I'm in.
Which is pretty much every episode.
Yeah.
In this particular episode, we were talking about various things that had been declared the such and such capital of the world. And one of the places that I mentioned was in Alabama. I don't recall the name of the city, but it was, as I said, the crappy capital of the world. Crappy being what, Brad?
Fish.
Fish. Well, Mother Glenda, a person whom you are probably fairly familiar with, as am I, she sent me a message saying, it might be worth knowing that when we went fishing at Aunt Katie's house, we were always fishing for crappie, and that's how it tends to be pronounced if you live up north. And sure enough, I looked it up. She has more experience in fishing than I do, and probably you as well.
Yes.
And she is quite correct that in most of the country, it is pronounced crappie and not crappy. Did you know that?
I didn't, but it's also true that really good readers and kids who read really early and are very literate tend to pronounce things wrong more often than poor readers, because good readers read things, they're making up their own pronunciations for things they don't know how to pronounce, whereas poor readers lean on their strength of hearing and repeating and understanding orally as opposed to seeing things visually. So I just think that means we're good readers, we're very literate.
Yeah, and that's why for years she was Hermione Granger instead of Hermione Granger.
That's right.
In my mind. Yeah, so I did a bunch of research. I actually read an article from a Kentucky newspaper which talked about how Kentucky considered changing the spelling of the fish from crappie to crappie in the 1960s to encourage a tourism boom. And I also did a little bit of research because that article did note that some places in the Deep South pronounce it crappie. And in fact, since I was talking about a town in Alabama, I thought maybe that town would have been crappie. But I watched 4 different YouTube videos of people in Alabama fishing for this fish, and they all said crappie as well. That is my ablutification because I definitely was wrong when talking about the majority of people, but it did lead me to learn a little bit more about it, which I enjoy.
Well, I have an edification for us this week.
Let's hear it.
Yeah. We've talked several times about Ernest Shackleton and his expedition to Antarctica.
Indeed we have.
Oh, Sir Ernest Shackleton, considering he was honored for his heroic failure, unlike Burke and Wills, who died on their heroic failure in Australia, episode 25. Anyway, he and his crew were icebound for many months before their ship sank, and then they went on this epic journey to safety. Well, Shackleton's ship, Endurance, was recently found deep in the ocean. So they found the actual ship 10,000 feet underwater, which they said they discovered on the 100th anniversary of Shackleton's funeral.
Wow.
So it's in fairly pristine condition for a 100-plus-year-old wreck due to the lack of wood destroying wildlife. The thing I was most struck with is that they found the wreck a mere 4 miles from where Frank Worsley, the navigator on that journey, said it sank. With the equipment and the lack of landmarks and the rare sightings of the sky they had at the time, that's an amazing piece of science for a man in 1915 to have accomplished, to have been able to pinpoint themselves that correctly.
Yeah, that's incredible.
Yeah. He's the reason they survived the trip from Elephant Island to South Georgia Island. But this just reinforces how brilliant Frank Worsley really was and how he's probably the reason that Shackleton survives.
Science!
Science.
Well, that's an excellent bit of edification, brother. Are we ready to move on?
I am ready to go. I'm ready to talk about some living dead, I guess.
All right, well, if you're ready to talk about it, take it away.
So this is from the Smithsonian Magazine.
Yeah.
200 years after the Salem witch trials, farmers became convinced that their relatives were returning from the grave to feed on the living.
Oh.
So that's where it started. Yeah, I saw this headline and said, all right, I'm going to read a little bit about this. And I read the Smithsonian article, and then I read a whole bunch of other articles. They all kind of stole from the Smithsonian article, the best I can see, because they all made the same error over and over again, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But while this is taking place in New England, like the Salem witch trials, I think it's important to point out, and you kind of did in our text exchange, the New England vampire scare did not seem to be as religiously motivated as the witch trials.
Yeah. Well, there was this Brown University historian who said that at the time, missionaries were going around saying there's no Bible in the home, there's no church going whatsoever. And in New England, during the 1800s, only about 10% of the population belonged to a church, which that blew my mind.
I mean, I know I've read some things that the Salem witch trials, which were 200 years before, kind of put the end to the Puritans. That whole thing, people started to look at it and said, what are we really getting out of the strictness that we have to live under? And then we don't do anything wrong, and now we're getting burned at the stake for no apparent reason.
Well, they didn't get burned at the stake in the Salem witch trials.
Well, I know. They got hung, but still.
They got hanged, or in the case of Giles Corey, they got pressed to death.
Yes, I'm aware. I was using that as the general theory that people get burned at the
Sure
stake.
you were. I just saved you an ablution.
You can save yourself. Anyway,
Yeah.
during the height of the vampire scare, consumption was the leading cause of death in the New England area. And what is consumption?
Consumption is a name commonly used at that time for tuberculosis, and it's related to the effect of this disease on the body. It just kind of drains your life force, which is how those comparisons to vampire type things started to happen. Because, yeah, you just kind of wear away and it looks like the life was sucked out of you.
Yeah. And combined with the losses of young people during the Civil War, as you moved into the late 1800s, parts of New England were fairly heavily depopulated.
And migrations and all that, yeah.
Yeah, and people were dying left and right of consumption. It was a pretty bleak time, and people were pretty desperate. So in Exeter, Rhode Island, which is about 30 minutes south of Providence, where Brown University is, since you mentioned Brown.
Oh, there you go. I've been there.
Mercy Lena Brown's mother died first, and then a year after that, her sister. And then her brother, Edwin, got ill and went to Colorado Springs to try and get healthy. So he sent himself out to a sanatorium, probably hanging out there with Doc Holliday. So he's staying out there. And then 10 years after her sister's death, Mercy Lena dies. And her brother kept getting sicker. And he came back from Colorado because he was going downhill. And so desperate locals decided that perhaps one of the three women was feasting on Eddie's poor body. Edwin's father, George Brown, gave them permission to exhume the bodies, wanting to find signs of fresh blood in their hearts, because the theory was they were eating him while he was sleeping, and they would have blood in their hearts.
Yeah.
And they dug up the mother and the sister, and they were basically dust. Then they dig up Lena, who had died recently, so her body still had a little bit of blood in the heart. So they thought, well, Lena's doing this. And so they cut out her heart and liver, burned them on a rock, and fed the ashes to Edwin.
Great idea.
He died 2 months later.
Did he eat the ashes, or did they mix up a cocktail with them? I read somewhere that a lot of people drank them.
They did not say specifically. I did look for it, what they did. But either way, didn't help.
Let me ask you quickly, though. if you needed to consume the ashes of a deceased relative, what would you like in the cocktail mix if you were to drink it?
If I were going to drink it?
Yeah, you want to have a consumption cocktail.
Something that's thick and heavy flavor, so maybe like a milkshake.
Oh.
It's already thick.
You drink their milkshake. You drink it up. That would be great.
I'd probably put it in a stew if you gave me a choice.
Good call there.
Yeah, because it's already thick. It's already got a lot of flavor in it.
Yeah.
Maybe you wouldn't notice it. But these were fairly common. I went and read an excerpt from Henry David Thoreau from one of his journals.
Yeah.
From September 29th, 1859, which is a few years before he died of consumption.
He did.
And I found a digital version of his journals online at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And everything I read said it was on September 29th. And so this is where I'm saying I think everything came from that same Smithsonian article and they all just copied and pasted.
Yeah.
Because that's actually the wrong date. It was actually the 26th of September if you want to go look for it. But on the 26th of September, he led into it by talking about spiders he observed running on water. Then he went to, "The savage in man is never quite eradicated. I have just read of a family in Vermont who, several of its members having died of consumption, just burned the lungs and heart and liver of the last deceased in order to prevent any more from having it."
It's such a great concept. Let's dig up a body. Let's remove the vital organs. If they still have a little bit of blood in them, even better. Then let's burn them. It's just such a weird thing to do, especially when you're doing it with your family members.
It does sound really weird, but, if you look through history, it can be pretty crazy. But right after that line, though, after he had just read about that, his next line, the last thing he put in his journal on September 26, 1859, was this line. "How feeble women, or rather ladies are. They cannot bear to be shined on, but generally carry a parasol to keep off the sun." Those were two very different topics he was going on. And when I was looking through his journal, that's the year that John Brown and his Harper's Ferry attack happens.
Yep.
And he had all this profound stuff to say about slavery and all that. And then this is what he has to say about women.
Two things that come to my mind when talking about that. First is, as I was just researching a little bit about tuberculosis, or in this case, really consumption because of the time period we're talking about, I was trying to figure out how it impacted New England, and I have more to say about that. But Emerson and Thoreau, both from Concord, Massachusetts, which led me to an article that talked all about what consumption was like, specifically in Concord. It was written by somebody named Constance Manoli Skoke on the Concord Library's website. And she just talked about how this disease worked its way through one community, which I thought was very interesting. And it talked about how it impacted people, the symptoms of the flushed cheeks, the bright eyes, the fever, the loss of appetite, and the cough. But it also led me to the fact that this was a family disease. So Ralph Waldo Emerson, who would have been Thoreau's, mentor, if you would say such a thing, Emerson was one who was successful during his lifetime, whereas a lot of the other transcendentalists especially did not achieve much for financial success. But Emerson, his father, his brothers, his first wife, they all died of consumption. He had symptoms of it himself, but he lived to be 79. And then Thoreau, not only did Thoreau die of it at age 44, his grandfather died of it, his father likely had it, his brother definitely had it, but managed to die of tetanus before he had a chance to die of consumption. And this is at a time period in history where things weren't as miserable necessarily, especially health-wise, as they would have been during medieval times and things like that. But as I've explored the various hysterias and panics and different things, it always seems like it was related to really bad times, a lot of political unrest, often religious issues, and quite often there was something related to a disease going through. So
right.
The Salem witch trials, which are 1692, a couple hundred years before this, have all sorts of different causes, Puritan fervor and all that. But people were paranoid about everything. They had experienced smallpox not too long before that. This scare, of course, was related to tuberculosis. And another plague that I was very interested in, another of these mass hysterical plagues, was definitely impacted by the bubonic plague outbreak over in Europe. And that's the dancing plague of 1518.
Ooh, the dancing plague. I have a mass hysteria that's related to a laughing attack, but nothing about dancing. What do you got on dancing plague?
Well, the dancing plague is one that I'd heard of before. It seems like whenever I've encountered it, they're usually telling the story of one occurrence of this, which happened in 1518, but it wasn't the only one. In fact, there are well-documented accounts over in Europe which occurred from the 1370s through this dancing plague of 1518. And there were ones before and after that. It was occurring in Germany, Holland, Switzerland. I've actually been to 3 places over there that all had various experiences with dancing plagues. I was in Schaffhausen in Switzerland. I was in Augsburg where I got a parking ticket. I was in Cologne where I got to go to the Haribo plant. All these places had their own dancing panics. But in 1518, probably the most famous one, that took place in Strasbourg, which at the time was a part of the Holy Roman Empire, now is a part of France. In this particular version of the Dancing Plague, which by the way has some other wonderful names, Dancing Plague is also known as Dancing Mania, St. Vitus's Dance, but my favorite name for dancing plagues, Choreomania.
I like it.
If ever we have a dance group, it's going to be called
Choreomania, yeah.
But anyway, let me read an article that I found. It was about the tightest summary I found. It was from history.com, written by somebody named Evan Andrews. The Dancing Plague of 1518. Evan said, in July 1518, residents of the city of Strasbourg were struck by a sudden and seemingly uncontrollable urge to dance. The hysteria kicked off when a woman known as Frau Trophy, which only some of the sources credit her as the original person, some say it was an unknown person, but when she stepped into the street and began to silently twist, twirl, and shake, she kept up her solo dance-a-thon for nearly a week, and before long, some 36 other Strasbourgeois had joined in. By then, the dancing epidemic had claimed as many as 400 victims. With no other explanation for the phenomenon, local physicians blamed it on hot blood and suggested the afflicted simply gyrate the fever away. A stage was constructed. Professional dancers were brought in. The town even hired a band to provide backing music. But it wasn't long before the marathon started to take its toll. Many dancers collapsed from sheer exhaustion. Some died from strokes and heart attacks. The strange episode didn't end until September, when the dancers were whisked away to a mountaintop shrine to pray for absolution. The Strasbourg dancing plague might sound like the stuff of legend, but it's well documented in 16th century historical records.
So they built them a stage they're like, well, we've got free entertainment. Let's take advantage of it.
Exactly. And these people who were experiencing some kind of psychogenic illness were encouraged to continue. Many of them were described as being in a trance and just dancing. Many of the facts are disputed, such as the causes or the number of deaths. Some people say there were no deaths. Some people say there were as many as 15 deaths a day at various periods during these several months. Whatever the case may be, whether it was a few dozen people or several hundred people who were ultimately impacted, this dancing plague was a pretty big deal. And like I said, this one was very much tied to people who were also going through crummy times. Specifically, they'd had round after round of bubonic plague. Of course, there were poverty. There were other issues that we would now identify as public health concerns that were constantly plaguing them. This is credited by many people as being one of the first examples of a mass hysteria.
Did you say psychogenic?
Psychogenic. So specialists who have studied mass hysterias, well, it can have a very simple definition, a mass hysteria. The middle school level definition is a condition affecting a group of persons characterized by excitement or anxiety, irrational behavior, beliefs, or inexplicable symptoms of illness. But most scientists think that it probably deserves a little bit more clinical definition. So according to Medical News Today, specialists who have taken interest in this phenomenon say that this is a type of psychogenic illness. That is, a condition that begins in the mind rather than in the body. Mass hysteria is also described as a conversion disorder in which a person has physiological symptoms affecting the nervous system in the absence of a physical cause of the illness, and may appear in reaction to psychological distress. So I thought this was all very interesting that so many of these different hysterias could be linked to disease. They could also be linked to people showing off. They could be linked to any number of things. A lot of those refrains between the vampire hysteria, the dancing plague of 1518, and the Salem witch trials here in the U.S., which occurred in the 1690s, they all share a lot of those same hallmarks of just crummy time going on, big diseases gone through.
Right.
Those Salem witch trials end up being pretty dissimilar to the vampire hysteria, though, which I found was pretty interesting because the Salem witch trials were definitely driven by that strict puritanical way of life, which was already losing steam. That city on the hill that people like the Mathers were talking about was already disappearing. and then suspicions related to the merchant class growing, smallpox and other disease coming through, potential of either native attacks or attacks from foreign powers. All these disputes were coming together. One thing tying back to what you had said about, was it Thoreau who was making the lovely comments about women?
Yeah.
The Salem witch trials, it was 80% women who were accused. The same was true back in England, where witch trials had already died up, but had happened for many centuries before that. It was about 80% women from the late 1590s to the mid-1600s when those hysterias were sweeping around Europe. I saw one thing that said that women were equal in the eyes of God, but not equal in the eyes of the devil, and women considered to be weaker and more susceptible to the temptations of the devil. So, as with so many topics we've already discussed on our show, women are picked on, women are persecuted a lot more than men. Of the 19 people who were hanged in the Salem witch trials, 14 of them were women, although at least none of them were pressed. Giles Corey was pressed because he wouldn't admit guilt, which meant his family wouldn't be able to inherit everything. If he had admitted guilt, his family would have been able to inherit things. So it was a big deal that he didn't admit to any wrongdoing. But one last thing I want to say about Giles Corey, though. Anybody who's our age should go to the Salem Witch Museum if they're in that part of the world, because it is an attraction from like the 1970s or 80s that has not changed, and it never should. You go in this old church, you sit around this lit up red light in the middle of the room, and then there's somebody who comes on with a deep voice and tells you about Satan. But the best part of that whole production to me is when they show the part of the diorama where Giles Corey is laying under some kind of wooden board and rocks are being stacked on top. That's pressing. But Giles Corey says, "More weight! More weight!" And then they put one more rock on him, and Giles Corey goes, "Ugh!" And then the music strikes, and Satan's eyes light up.
That does sound impressively fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of nice, a reminder that humans have always been superstitious and prone to conspiracy theories.
Sure.
I did find an article from one local writer in the 1850s. Many people saw it as crazy. He wrote, "We seem to have been transported back to the darkest age of unreasoning ignorance and blind superstition, instead of living in the 19th century and in a state calling itself enlightened and Christian."
Yeah.
That was after an 1854 exhumation. I also found, I was researching the history of vampirism, and all stuff most people probably know if you've ever cared to know. But Voltaire was writing about vampirism.
Oh.
And he said something that I feel like probably rings as true today as it did then. After slander, nothing is communicated more promptly than superstition, fanaticism, sorcery, and tales of those raised from the dead.
Jeez.
Yeah, so Voltaire saw that people were doing that even back then. I mean, I can't say too much about it because I did go at least twice to see if we could see the Headless Motorcycle Man in our hometown of Elmore, Ohio.
Oh, the Elmore rider that everybody growing up there knows as the Headless Motorcycle Man.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's kind of a hysteria because the whole idea is he lost his head in a motorcycle accident after World War I while riding in a peak of rage about his girlfriend leaving him or cheating on him, however you want to say it.
Yeah, while he was gone.
Yeah, you can honk your horn 3 times, flash your lights, and on this bridge on the day of his death in March, along will come the Headless Motorcycle rider.
Yeah.
Another part is that you're supposed to be able to, if you're playing music, it will start playing backward.
I think that part was related to there's supposed to be a hearse following you. A ghost hearse if you played the song backward.
I think it's been added to over the years.
Yeah. Do you remember Prince factoring into this?
That's where I was going to say. Yeah. And that's why I remember going with Carolyn because we were playing Prince and someone, I don't remember who it was in the car, said it'd be kind of hard to know if this was playing backwards or not. I just remember that happening.
I think those are two different things. The hearse, I think, was on a different road altogether.
Are you sure?
No, but I do remember looking for both. I also remember that was another Big Tan van time. Yeah. One of the times that we went out for the Headless Motorcycle Man. And Sister Angie, if I recall correctly, I remember her getting out of the van and like taking off running. That might be imagined.
I remember the same. I remember that we thought we saw something and she got out to chase it because she is apparently much more brave than I am.
She was going to beat up a headless man, but hopefully she was going to do it with punches to the gut because the headshots wouldn't do much good. maybe this needs to be a Sister Angie segment instead of a Father Art segment today.
I think it might need to be to clarify. Yeah.
I'm sure she has opinions on vampires and on whether women deserve to be considered more susceptible to the devil. I wonder if Angie has been tempted by the devil at some point.
Well, as they say, in hell there'll be good company.
Yep.
Mass hysterias, like you said, have been around for some time, and there's documentation of them. But it's not just country rubes or bumpkins who don't know what's going on. It happens in literate societies and well-established. It happens in all different societies. I mean, there was the War of the Worlds hysteria with Orson Welles.
Sure.
There was the whole clown in the woods thing in the 2010s, where people thought there were clowns coming out of the woods to kill people.
There's the Macarena.
You consider that a mass hysteria? I'm gonna let that one go.
It swept the nation, and it seems problematic.
I'll allow it.
Okay.
I was curious about other mass hysterias that happened more recently. You went way back.
Yeah.
I found one, a laughing attack in Tanzania.
Ooh.
It even made some schools close for several months. There were kids that would just start laughing uncontrollably. Oh. And it would spread, and it would last from a few hours to several days, where they would just be laughing. Not really scary. No one died. School got canceled for a few days here and there, but otherwise, no big deal. Then there was the Pokémon panic, which took place on my birthday in 1997.
Do tell.
Where 12,000 people in Japan reported symptoms like nausea and seizures, and 700 kids went to the hospital. Apparently, some flashing lights in an episode of Pokémon may have triggered seizures for some kids. Then the news about it caused anxiety, and additional kids started suffering illnesses at the same time because they had watched the episode and became concerned that they were sick, and their parents got concerned, and they got concerned. So it just spread. It did lead to new laws in Japan about flashing strobe effects and things in TV shows. So that's probably good out of that.
Sure.
There was one in Portugal in May 2006 where a bunch of school children started reporting symptoms like rashes, difficulty breathing, and dizziness. And it turns out that the kids were suffering from a mass hysteria based on the symptoms of illness suffered on a popular TV drama called Morangos com Açúcar, or Strawberries with Sugar. And so they've been around. But my favorite random mass hysteria was from the 1950s in Seattle. It was called the Seattle Windshield Pitting Epidemic.
How do you pit a windshield?
Where people were reporting holes and pits or dings suddenly appearing out of nowhere in their windshields. There were a variety of reasons concocted, including new power plants that were nearby and different things. Some weird gamma rays or something. It was a bunch of things that came up, but it was just a mass hysteria. It ended about 15 days after it started. The local police chief in Seattle came out and said, maybe it's like 5% crime and 95% crazy. And so he said a few of them may be real, the rest probably aren't, and that pretty much ended it. So after about 3,000 reports, it dissipated and went away. I guess we're prone to it as humans of becoming hysterical, and that's, I guess, what we do.
It's not going anywhere. Actually, in the Witch Museum in Salem in Massachusetts, they talk about hysteria and how it continues. I was trying to think whether the vampire panic actually constitute a mass hysteria because it wasn't as epidemic in terms of the amount of people it was happening to.
And it lasted a long time. It went for over 100 years.
It's certainly a hysteria.
Yeah.
Maybe not quite to the level of a mass hysteria.
Which is probably why we don't still know about it, I suppose, as much as the witch trials. But I guess if it's true that Bram Stoker read an article in a local London newspaper a year before he published Dracula, and one of the characters suffers in similar ways to Mercy Lena Brown. There is even a possibility the character Lucy is based on Mercy Lena Brown, being an amalgamation of Mercy and Lena. If you really look closely, I suppose we can get there. And the consumption, teenager, body exhumed, presided over by a doctor, all consistent with newspaper article that was published the year before Dracula was published. So it kind of does live on in the world if that is the case.
As I was looking at all this, the topic of whether something lived on was something I was interested in, and specifically, I was wondering about tuberculosis, what it was, what it is. It certainly inspired the text that we're talking about today. I saw from the Center of Disease Control website, in the year 2020, in the United States, there were 8,916 reported cases of tuberculosis. Whereas back in 1953, when a lot of the antibiotics and medicines started to come out that could help us effectively fight against tuberculosis, In 1953, there were over 84,000 cases in the United States. So we've certainly been able to fight back against it. There are parts of the world where it is still very much happening. Those are usually places that have many of the public health issues that we would have been having further back. Because we discovered the bacteria that causes tuberculosis back in the 1880s. When do you think the first sanatorium in the United States opened, Brad?
I don't know, but it must have been open in the 1890s when Edwin Brown went there.
Yeah, well, 1875, Asheville, North Carolina. By 1904, there were 115 sanatoriums in the United States, according to the CDC, which could serve about 8,000 people. By 1953, there were 839 sanatoriums, which could help as many as 136,000 people at a time. But I wanted to see a contemporary account to the actual vampire hysteria, talking about what actually these people who had tuberculosis would have experienced that time. I found exactly that in Smithsonian Magazine with an article by Abigail Tucker called The Great New England Vampire Panic. And she actually said the following. Consumption had started to plague New England in the 1730s, a few decades before the first known vampire scares. By the 1880s, when the scares were at their height, the disease was the leading cause of mortality throughout the Northeast, responsible for almost a quarter of deaths, which is crazy. And here comes the description. It was a terrible end, often drawn out over years, a skyrocketing fever, a hacking, bloody cough, and a visible wasting away of the body. One contemporary account back in the 18th century said, the emaciated figure strikes one with terror, the forehead covered with drops of sweat, the cheeks painted with a livid crimson, the eyes sunk, the breath offensive, quick, and laborious, and the cough so incessant as to scarce allow the wretched sufferer time to tell his complaints. Systems progressed in such a way that it seemed like something was draining life and blood out of somebody. I'm excited, as I am with many of the diseases that would have killed our ancestors, to not have to deal with the possibility of getting tuberculosis or consumption or whatever we might call it.
Yeah, see.
Although I'm a bit sad that I probably am not going to get choreomania.
I'm happy that I am most likely not going to have to exhume your body, burn your organs, and then eat them. So I'm pleased about that.
Let's not rule it out. You've already decided what would be the vessel through which you would consume the ashes.
A hearty stew.
A hearty stew. Maybe a hearty stew and a milkshake.
You get it?
Oh,
you
a hearty stew.
Hearty stew. Yeah. I did learn when I was reading about Elmore and the ghostwriter that there are people who call themselves ghostorians.
Ghostorians?
Yes.
That's a good title. I did learn when writing a book about our native home of Elmore that the citizens of Elmore are called Elmorites, but I called us Elmorans. Actually, I called myself an Elmoran and acknowledged that we're really Elmorites.
You did go on an epic ride.
I did indeed. But I kept my head the whole time.
Well done.
Another person that has always kept her head, even when faced with a headless rider or two very annoying brothers, is our sister Angie. And we're going to ask her some questions today.
Have you ever mistaken somebody with tuberculosis for being a vampire?
No.
Have you ever met someone with tuberculosis?
No, but I know a lot of people who've been tested for tuberculosis.
Have you met a vampire?
Maybe.
Ooh. What type of vampire would you like to meet if you were going to meet one?
Definitely an energy vampire.
Do you recall ever having succumbed to choreomania or any other form of mass hysteria?
I do not.
Do you know what choreomania is?
I do not.
I believe it's a mass hysteria where you can't stop dancing.
Ooh. Perhaps I have succumbed to it at a wedding.
Your native hometown of Elmore, Ohio, is famous for having a headless motorcycle riding ghost. In your recollection, did you ever flee a big tan van after seeing said ghost?
I did, on more than one occasion.
On more than one occasion?
We went every year, and at least twice we believe that we encountered said headless motorcycle rider.
Why did you get out of the van?
Well, you can't see things clearly through a fogged-up windshield.
Both Jeff and I recalled you getting out of the van, but we couldn't recall why, or if it was true.
All true.
Your native hometown may also have a 19th century ghost hearse or something like that. Do you remember the details about that alleged phenomenon?
Oh no, I wish I did.
I remember something about you turn a corner and your music starts playing backwards and you look behind you and there's a hearse, but I don't remember anything else about it.
No, I wish I did. I do know about a picture in a mausoleum in the cemetery that if you watch it closely, the hand inside the vest slides backwards to reveal a knife.
I have tried to see that. I never was successful.
Oh, we saw it. Janet and I saw it, rode our bikes as fast as our little legs could pedal.
If you were listening to Prince's entire catalog, what percentage of songs would you be able to tell if they were being played backwards?
0%.
Well, folks, now that we've heard from Sister Angie, it means that our time together is coming to an end for this episode. We've said just about everything we're prepared to say about smallpox, the bubonic plague, the Pokémon panic, the Headless Motorcycle Man, and Choreomania. But fear not, just as soon as we can dig back into the archives and find another gem of a text exchange, there will be another episode coming your way. In the meantime, you can head over to our Instagram page at Things I Text My Brother Podcast to drop us a note about what you liked, what you didn't like, or to tell us about something we got totally wrong. You might even have time to go tell a friend, an enemy, and a total stranger to give us a listen as well. For bonus points, there's now a link in the show notes which will take you to the Things I Text My Brother store where you can buy pointless merchandise related to our episodes. If you manage to do any of that, the Fraternity of Drouillards will be forever grateful. But most importantly, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.
There were a few in the Nordeca. Actually, my favorite part of the Crew 2 game was Toronto took the lead.
Why? You shouldn't like that.
And the Toronto guy ran to the Nordeca corner where there were about 25 fans, and they were very vocal fans, and started taunting them, which I thought was fantastic because they're the only fans in the stadium. And he ran right up to them and started taunting them. And they responded back with, "Your bacon is ham. Your bacon is ham. F you, Canada. Your bacon is ham."
Oh, okay.
I like that chant.